Dipesh Chakrabarty, a name that evokes a sort of enigma. An extraordinarily ingenious scholar, a historian by training, currently serving as Lawrence Kempton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilization at the University of Chicago, yet associated as faculty member of Department of English, Law School, Center for Contemporary Theory, Cinema, Media Studies and Comparative Literature. He is the recipient of the very prestigious Toynbee Prize in 2014, named for Professor Arnold J. Toynbee, that recognizes social scientists across the globe for their outstanding academic and public contributions to humanity. Known for his unorthodox and seminal contributions to the realm of historical thought and the world of ideas, Professor Chakrabarty's latest work, called The Crisis of Civilization Exploring Global and Planetary Histories, which has come up recently in 2018, seeks to discuss the significance of climate change for humanistic and post-colonial thought. Chakrabarty argues in this work that such change demands not only critiques of capitalism and inequality, but also provocatively demands a new form of thinking about human species as a whole, that is, our patterns of justice, writing of history, our relationship with nature in the age of Anthropocene. Some of the other major works of Professor Chakrabarty, which bear the mark of his interventionist ideas, are, to name a few, Provincializing Europe, Historical Thought and Post-Colonial Difference, Habitations of Modernity, Rethinking Working Class History in Bengal 1819-1940, The Culling of History, Jadunath Sarkar and his Empire of Truth. He is also well known for his foundational association with Subaltern Studies Collective and its project. Sir, on behalf of Provincial University and its Center of Excellence on Odishan Studies and also its virtual resource center called Mapping Minds, I welcome you to this conversation program.
Thank you.
I also take this opportunity to convey the warm greetings of our Vice Chancellor, Professor Ishan Patra, and also allow me to do a small felicitation to you. Okay. So this is only symbolic. I'll just take it. This is.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much.
This is the invitation from our Vice Chancellor.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything.
We start here, sir.
Sure.
I don't know how to engage with you, a person, I mean, whom I rate as one of the very critical minds of our times. Professor Chakrabarty, the way I can recollect you, the way you came to be talked about in India and its academy, in the world of social science for South Asia particularly, way back in the 1980s. I was a student then in CHS JNU.
Right.
My supervisor was Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty.
Oh, okay.
And the identity with which you grew up as a member of the Subaltern Collective, enthusiastically taking forward the programmatic agenda of Subaltern Studies, particularly trying to very closely, I can see you were the only member who very closely followed Ranjit Guha and his ideas. Because when he talked about his one sentence in one piece, the Santal's idea of, and you problematize this, and this is the critical moment when you jumped into post-colonial. But I don't know. I mean, you have to tell me.
That is true.
So since the inception of Subaltern Studies in 1982 and your seminal early work on rethinking working class, which came up in 1989, and particularly your current engagement today in terms of Anthropocene, which we'll talk about it.
Sure.
And also the way you have been associated with different centers, like whether it is law, whether it is comparative literature, whether it is English literature, whether it is theory, whether it is anthropology. What describes you the best? A historian, a subalternist, a critical theorist, a postmodernist, a postcolonialist? What is it that we remain drawn to you? Or, for that matter, a humanist who thinks about the planet, species, life? How do you define this? How do you react to this?
I came to history through an unusual route, because I was a student of physics, and the other subjects I studied in college, my minor subjects. Physics was my honor subject, and the past subjects, as we call them, were mathematics and geology. And I always used to find geology fascinating, because, and when I went to Australia to do my PhD, I used to miss home. And I used to regret that I was a historian of India, because I used to think that if I were a geologist instead, everywhere would be home, because the earth would be my book to read, right? And I thought, because I'm so tied to India that I miss it, why did I come away? I should have stayed on in India. So all that suffering is to make me feel I should have studied a subject where you were at home everywhere. But see what happened, because I came into history later in life. The first 3 books that my professor Barunde, who was a great historian and also a great teacher, he didn't write all that much. He wrote a lot of articles, but not many books. But he was a great teacher. And because I came into history from outside without growing up as a history student, the first 3 books he got me to read were E.H. Carr's What is History? Then Robin Collingwood's Historical Imagination, The Idea of History, and Mark Bloch's The Historian's Craft. So I used to joke by saying that I was such a backward student of Barunde that I could never get beyond the question, what is history? Because that is the question he started me off with. I have said this somewhere, that if India had better counseling services in undergraduate institutions, and I was a science student in school, because we had to declare whether we would be a science student or a humanities student in the West Bengal education, which was Indian education system. In my youth, school was 11 years, not 12 years.
Yeah, we also passed through the same thing.
Right. And so school was 11 years, college was 3 years, honestly. And then master's would be 2 years. And we had to declare on entering class 9 whether we would do science or we would do arts. My most favorite subject was basically Vaishnav poetry in Bangla. So
in Bangla?
In Bangla. So I used to love reading Chandi and Vidyapati. Mainly because my mother was a school teacher and she used to teach Bangla literature. She was an MA in Bangla, and all her MA books were there. So my most favorite subject, I think, was Vaishnav literature. But I was also reasonably good in mathematics, or I used to find science interesting. My father's degree was in physics. So my father, and basically there was also middle class fear throughout India, that if you do humanities, you won't get a job, you'll have to struggle. The middle class family, so they used to think of security. So they said, at least with a science degree, you'll be more employable.
This still continues.
It continues. And within school, within college, there was this assumption that somehow science students were more intelligent. There's a cultural assumption. So if you thought of yourself as somewhat, reasonably intelligent, then you thought, I would be giving the wrong impression to people by doing humanities, right? If you're young, and studying physics in Presidency College was very glamorous those days, because IIT was not as glamorous. We used to think of engineers as, in Bangla word was Hathudi, who worked in Hathudi. So they used to call it Hathudi Vidya. Whereas physics was like asking fundamental questions. Physics was almost like philosophy. Yeah. And the ultimate questions in physics are philosophy, same philosophy question. And So now I realize that I'm very grateful that I did science because, at least science doesn't scare me. I mean, I have colleagues, if you give them a page of science to read, I don't want to read this, right? Science doesn't scare me. But deep down, I was a humanities person. So if you had good counseling, then I would have probably done some kind of philosophy.
Just to interrupt here, I mean, you have talked about doubling of consciousness. So
Right.
you're deep down humanities and also,
Studying science.
So
But I was not the only person. One problem with Nehru's India was that there was so much more social incentive given to studying science and engineering.
privilege. Science was
As we were coming into our adolescence and into our puberty and adolescence and becoming aware of, gender relations, marriage, those sorts of things, in the marriage columns in Bangla newspapers, which you call Patra Patri column, the value of engineers was going up. Everybody said an engineer groom is desirable. So all those things were basically informally, what they did, they often put some of the best children in school into science stream. But many of my physics classmates who were very bright people, as interested in poetry, theatre, literature, novels as myself, but studying physics, ended up being bank officers.
yeah.
So you did not need to read so much science to become a bank officer.
Yeah.
Right? So I often
You
think
do, I mean, study agriculture and land up in bank.
that, right, exactly. So you can
This is the biggest irony.
and do equal, exactly. So in some ways, I think the Nehruians did very good things, but there was some wastage of talent in that sense. And so eventually when I found my way back into history was because I met Borun Babu in IIM when I was studying at IIM, and I found history fascinating. So history is what gave me an entry into social science, humanities, and ultimately I think when I was doing my thesis, so Borun Babu actually taught me history for, I would say, for 4 or 5 years, in the sense that I took all his classes in IIM, about 1 year, and then another year I joined, because the Calcutta University would not let me do PhD in history. I had no degrees in history. So they said you have to do a BA, you have to do another MA. But in the meanwhile, I joined in a doctoral program at IIM, which was called the Fellow Program. And as part of that, Borun Babu taught me history for a year. For 1 whole year, he actually taught me. I was the only student.
So that was the turning point.
That was the turning point. And he was a very good teacher. Plus, he would teach inside class, outside class. There was a bus institute bus on which we used to come back. And I used to sit next to him. And I would tell him what I had read during the day. And he would tell me, okay, this is good. And the fascinating thing was Irfan Habib, Nurul Hasan, Bipan Chandra, they were all his friends. So for me, it was like I felt that people I was reading in print were my professor's friends.
Quite
how you
visual,
feel?
yeah.
It brings it home, right? It's first time I went to History Congress was Muzaffarpur History Congress in 1972. And Borun Babu couldn't come, but he wrote me letters of introduction, which I presented to Irfan Saab, to Bipan Chandra, Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. Sabyasachi I knew from IIM. I became friends with Majid Siddiqui, Muzaffar Alam I met. And they all accepted me as a member of the tribe because of the letter that Borun they had written, introducing me. Right?
History from below then had already come up.
It was coming up, and
But you were not aware of this.
No, I was in the sense, I was, because I was trying to do working class history with him.
Okay.
So I was aware of it. That he had trained me. He had got me to read E.P. Thompson.
Okay.
So I had some sense of what that was, and obviously I was learning. And then the center happened in '73.
Right.
He became the director, so he gave me a fellowship there. So Gautam Bhadra and I, we started as fellows on the same day, in the same room. And it was reuniting with Gautam, who was in college with me studying history when I was studying physics. Our only bond then was the Naxalite movement. And then we met again, and Gautam had finished an MPhil in JNU with Sabyasachi, come back. And we were in the same office. Partho had finished his PhD and come back. Then Hitesh Sandal was there, Shivani Kinkar Chobe was there. And I was suddenly in the middle of this social science. Amir Bakchi joined. And I was the most ignorant member of the community.
So is the context that made you a historian?
Well, no, Barun Babu taught me to be a historian, but they were mostly doing history. Even Parthu began to do history.
Yeah.
Even though
That's
it's
very
done political
interesting.
science. History of nationalism.
From games theory to history.
From games theory to history. Hitesh Babu was doing history, Dutta was doing history, Gautam was doing, Indrani Rai was doing history. So then Ashok Chen was economist but doing history, like Tipu Sultan, Ramohan Roy. So I learnt a lot because I was the most ignorant person. So I was like a blotting paper, soaking up whatever they said, while also trying to do my own work. It helped to orient myself. But then as I was doing the work, the first problem was, so I had come from Presidency College sympathetic to Marxism, Naxalism, Mao Zedong. I used to read party literature as an undergraduate student. But when I began to do work, the first problem I had was that I discovered that Hindu workers and Muslim workers had been fighting in the 1890s. During Bakrid, there would be riots. But so I presented those findings a year before I left for Australia. And everybody was very critical, a room full of Calcutta Marxists. And they attacked me, they were very critical because I had not found a way to explain this antagonism, Hindu-Muslim fight between workers, in such a way that it did not look like the workers' fault. That if I could say, okay, the market was causing this problem, or the maliks, the owners were causing this problem, they would have been happier. But because I had said, there is religion at work. These Muslims are setting up Muslim associations. Their sardars are setting up mosques. So there's something called religion there. But those days Marxists, they want to explain religion away. Right?
You have very brilliantly said somewhere that one lives through Quranic and Puranic dynamics.
Right.
So that's very interesting.
We live through Quranic. Those are thoughts that came later. So,
of course.
So, so that's where my trouble with my inherited Marxism started. And they were very critical. But I had this feeling that these people who are becoming workers in Calcutta mills, they are not history-less people. They come with their own understanding, with their own history from villages, from their religious practices, whatever. And religion matters to them. And I cannot write a history that makes religion just a superficial expression of something deeper. This sense of unease with my received Marxism eventually made me write a thesis in which I was both writing with the help of Marxian categories and thinking at the same time, do these categories really apply? Or what is the problem with using these categories? So my thesis became Rethinking Working Class History.
Yeah.
And if you read the last chapter where I discuss this problem, I often say that the last chapter of Rethinking Working Class History is actually the first chapter of Provincializing Europe.
Okay, that's true.
Yeah, because that's where I was raising questions, what is the relationship between the categories with which we think about history, with which we write history, and the actual history.
So your today's test back to rethinking.
It's sort of, yeah.
Okay,
so,
great.
So provincializing, that last chapter is expressing my unease with the received Marxism.
I'll stop here because you have several other issues to discuss. It's very difficult to get you.
Sure.
I just have to, you have already talked about your fascination with physics, then you briefly had slipped into management,
right,
and then came back to history line.
Right.
But yet still you exhibit very critical moments of distancing and departure from its disciplinary boundary. Sometimes to the utter disquiet of historians like us. Why Dipesh is talking like this? How do you explain such a strategy? You have already said so about religion. You have already said so. It's something to do with one thing. I just because I'm putting emphasis on this.
Sure.
Something to do with what you famously say as different ways of being human. That's the only thing. Because the other part you have already said.
So you know, I think the question of religion has been a central question, even though I have not addressed it as such. But this unease around the riots to do with Bakrid, and this unease that with a Marxism that could not handle religion, that always had to say, later on I had a debate with Sumit Sarkar about Enlightenment rationalism. And there also I said that India, South Asia is a place where everyday life is full of gods, goddesses, spirits. Even Muslims participate in that world, right? Sufi dargahs where people go and pray, tie things on those railings to pray.
Yeah.
You cannot imagine this land, and this is not just subaltern. All middle class boys and girls coming to do their exams would, the moment the bus goes past Kalibadi, they would say, do this. Yeah. On the other hand, we don't have any understanding of that. I've often said to my good friend Kunal Chakrabarty,
Okay.
and I said, Kunal, you write about the Puranas, but modern India is understandable if you don't know how the Puranas are part of modernity. I mean, think of you get into a car, a minibus, you will have a picture of Kali where the driver is. Now, you can say it is insurance against accidents so that accident doesn't happen, but these are Puranic goddesses. And the way you have a picture framing Kali, then Ramakrishna and Sharada Devi on two sides, and Vivekananda in the middle. So, if you can bring within the same frame a Puranic person and historical persons.
You have given this example in retrospect and reminiscence.
Right. So, you can say that how the Puranic time and our historical time, they all come together.
Both you and Professor Chatterjee agree on this. I mean, he also talks about how
So, my point is, what is the relationship between the time of the discipline of history, which is secular? Because within history, you can't say, which is what I say in minority history, subaltern past. Within a historical explanation, you cannot say that, Professor Nanda came and met with Professor Chakrabarty because this was divinely ordained. If you wrote that in your textbook, or if you teach that to your PhD student, then they will say, go to the school of theology, not to this school, right? So history internally cannot be theological in that sense. So this is why there's a distinction between religious history and history of religion. So if you write history within an Islamic tradition, you can never deny the Prophet's revelation. So if you write history as a believer, you cannot deny that the Prophet had a revelation. And then all the historical questions about how does a man who was himself not so well educated produce this language, this text, that is actually beautiful in Arabic, people tell me, very rich. You would not be able to, that will not be a relevant question for you, because that is a historian's question.
Yeah.
Right? So in an Islamic mode of writing history, revelation is true. In a historical mode of writing that history, you would have to say, it is said that he had a revelation, right? And I'm not saying we should mix the two. I'm not saying we should identify, we should equate the two. But I was thinking...
Somewhere you have said that this giveaway word called belief.
Right, exactly. The Protestant word.
Yeah.
My question is, what is my relation? So that's why I said, look, when I write the history of India, I write it in that secular way. But I have what they call a fore-understanding, that is understanding before actual understanding of this field of the religious.
So this fore-understanding is understanding...
Before you have a proper understanding.
Okay. I never got that.
Because I've grown up in it. For me, it is not... See, I had an aunt who's very poor.
Is that incipient understanding?
Yeah, you can. So Heidegger calls it core understanding.
Core understanding.
That is understanding you have. You already have it.
It was very difficult.
Because you are already in that world. And this is true of historians everywhere. Because no.
I am having been something like that.
Right. So no, in the sense that, see, you grew up as a child. What happens if there's a puja in the family? So your somebody grown up says, okay, now we are doing Anjali or do pranam or do namo. I mean, so to give you an example from this household, my wife has a little niece, 4-year-old. So his grandmother, my wife's mother, so every evening she goes with a dhoop and to every room.
Standard practices.
Standard practice. But now the child does it with her.
Yeah.
So you see, this is basically what you're doing. With this dhoop, you are fending off everything that is ashubha. So this is about the keeping the household as shubha. Now the child doesn't understand the concept behind it, but the child is growing up doing it. Child is growing up seeing her grandmother do it. And one day you might know the concept behind, you may not, but it is not an unfamiliar thing. You're already part of that relationship. So that's why I was saying that because any moment in history is never exclusively modern. Just as this room has pieces of furniture coming from different periods. I mean, if you look at these chairs, I can't put them, but maybe some of the styles are older than others. Similarly, this non-secular world in which gods and spirits are part of our life is something to which we all have access as human beings. And the access you have as human being is the foreunderstanding which informs the history you write as a historian. So I would say that to be a historian is one particular way of being. But you come into that way of being having known other ways of being.
Yeah.
Right?
You exemplify this with the reference to Arun Sarkar's
right, the poetry or this Irish lady.
Poetry. And also Didi Kosambi's, using...
right, exactly. That's why I said that...
That's very interesting.
So I was giving example of Kosambi and to people to say that they are denying the co-evality of these things. See, Kosambi, by saying that this is a remnant of the Stone Age, is actually denying the modernity of that.
He must have also participated in that ritual.
Exactly,
That's very interesting.
Exactly. So Kosambi may not have consciously believed in it. So that's why I said, that gods and spirits do not depend on our beliefs.
It's on the practices.
They're in the practices, they're already there.
Very brilliant.
They're already there. So, just as when you say goodbye to somebody, saying goodbye, God be with you, that is the expanded form, is the same as Khuda Hafiz. But if I'm saying goodbye, I don't believe in God, you don't believe in God, but I say goodbye to you. But God is there in the word.
Yeah.
And there, God's existence there is not dependent on your or my belief. It's in the practice that I say goodbye. I'm not going to invent a new word to say. So this is how the past survives. Yeah. Maybe one day, maybe there was a time when some people understood that to say goodbye is to entrust you to God. Right?
And that takes me back to some of your very interesting observation that structuralism exists, the cultural code.
Right.
And also the past.
When subaltern studies started, so I've said this somewhere, but you see, the first time, so when I was growing up as a historian with Borunde's teaching, basically the deep divisions, immediate divisions were ancient, medieval, modern. And as I've said, this was a problem with Indian history, and this is a legacy of the British mode of education. Nobody said learn languages. The idea was that if you're doing Mughal, you need to learn Arabic and Persian. If you're doing modern, it's enough to know Odia and English, or Bangla and English, or Telugu and English. Your bilinguality is all you need. And if you're doing an ancient, you do Sanskrit.
Yeah.
Right? But actually, you need all these languages to do your modern, to do it properly. So I'm just going to say that when I went to first time to his place, and he was reading out to me the final draft of the chapter on negation, and he was explaining 19th century torture of peasants by referring to Manu. And I thought historians would not know, they would have to show what is the difference that other ages have made to Manu. I mean, you can't just go from a 3rd century to 19th century, leap like that. But I still remember the sentence where he says, you see, Manu formulates some relationship, husband is to wife, king is to Raja is to Praja, Guru is to Shishya, similarly hierarchical. So he said, this is basically a relationship of domination, subordination that Manu is theorizing, and you find that. And I had these two responses. I was thought, this is not how I've been taught to do history. I have to then show that Manu is being read in the 19th century, something like this. And I also thought, but at the same time, everything he said felt true. I felt this is not even 19th century. I know it from my life. Poor people get beaten up. Even in the 50s, domestic servants used to be beaten. So when I was a child, if they did something wrong, today nobody would dare. Because today...
Because state is vigilant.
So they are also more organized. They can come and vandalize your house. Yeah. So their power also scares people. But in the 50s when I was growing up, you would still address taxi drivers as Tumi. And I remember taxi drivers protesting saying, Tumi kano bolchen? Apni bolun. And I remember my father having to learn this. Okay. Having to learn to stop saying Tumi. I mean, there are historical backgrounds. There are more middle class people joining these professions, partition refugees and things. But also, husbands were beaten up if they refused to take smallpox vaccination, because they were very scared of cholera vaccination. And my father would be scared that if they didn't get it, we would get it. Because then the servant would bring the disease. So he would actually coerce the servant into getting the vaccination when the corporation person came, right? So when Ranjita was talking about peasants beating up landlords or treating them badly, calling them tum, and he said this is 19th century. I said, Ranjita, it is both 19th century and 20th century. It is also my life. So what is my historical relationship to this thing? If this is 19th century, this is 20th century, it is also Manu. It's such a wide span. What are you saying? And then I realized he was using structuralism to say that certain codes of relationship can get communicated over generations through practice by getting culturally codified so that you are not even aware, right? So, so certain codes of hierarchy, this is what he was saying. So suddenly he made structuralism. Later on, I was in England for 3 months. And after Ranjit, this experience of his reading his chapter, I bought all the books on structuralism I could. And I used to do archival research during the day, and in the evening I had to read structuralism. And then I came back and I used to see structure everywhere. I used to see codes everywhere. The story I have told of Chandi Chowk and a man with a Baj Pakhi, falcon, on his hand.
Shabash.
And the Jat person says Shabash.
And your encounter with the historians.
And I actually, and they said, this is bad, this is all bakwas, But next day, I ran into my friend Niladri Bhattacharya.
Achha.
And I said to Niladri, you know what happened yesterday?
I was wondering, who could have been the historian? Yeah. Now you have given me the answer.
No, I can release it. I said to Niladri, I ran into this situation yesterday. And the man was going with the falcon on his hand. And can you guess what my scooter driver said? And Niladri said, Shabash. Then I know the code existed. How would Niladri know otherwise? Right? So it was very interesting encountering structuralism. We encountered post-structuralism through Gayatri Spivak. Yeah. But what Ranjita taught us was the relationship between structure and history. Because this is what he was doing in inventory aspects.
Yeah.
Right? It was very exciting to discover structuralism, to find these kind of answers because it made you think more.
Yeah.
You know, not just go to archives and write this history, and it made you think about what is the relation
Not
between
all, no, very few. Rather, I would qualify. I mean, very few people could be induced to think like this.
Well,
That's
he
my,
was very inspiring.
Yeah.
He was because he cared for ideas,
yeah.
and he
This collective, in fact, took this agenda very seriously.
yeah, the collective, and I personally took it very seriously, and it transformed my thinking.
Yeah. Let me move on.
Sure.
And again, coming back to this subaltern collective affairs, which existed for 30 years, and somebody, I mean, Prof. Chatterjee said 30 years is not less
a small time.
It's a small time. So, while reflecting on post-subaltern possibilities, you talk about generative mistakes, generative errors of the project. And these mistakes, as you have very rightly said, and very aptly said, is very provocative. In the nature of mistakes of great thinkers that end up having longer lives, very long life something. And not because they're silly and obvious, I'm quoting you, but because they're fascinating and interesting. And very few people could have dubbed mistakes as fascinating and interesting. That I was drawn to. Committed precisely because the questions behind them were of fundamental nature. And then you tend to identify this archaic in the modern subject of history. History means Indian history also, as two such generative errors of subaltern project. Can we see your current projects, whether it is Anthropocene or thinking through ideas about time, species, planet, propelled by such errors?
Yeah, very good question. First of all, I have to thank you for reading me seriously.
I don't know.
You read me closely, and I'm very grateful. So just to go back to the thought, so basically, I came to the realization that when I was young, an undergraduate student, I used to think of Marx as true, others as false. And that's how we grew up, knowing that Marx was correct, Max Weber was wrong. Without realizing that these are thinkers working with the same traditions, two German thinkers with the same heritage. And I also realized that nobody has the final truth about human beings. So in a profound sense, they're all mistaken. And the difference is between whether, as I say also to my students, I said whether you make such a rich, generative and interesting mistake that we all go back and read you. Because you're stimulating to read. You may have been mistaken, but you're very stimulating. You give me a way of thinking. Or whether you make an uninteresting mistake and people forget about it. I mean, these things only matter if ideas matter to you. Otherwise, they don't matter. There are many historians who will just go and say, okay, this happened, that happened. For them, the mistakes are factual. And factual mistakes can be corrected. I mean, if you get Nehru's year of birth wrong, it can be corrected. There are other documents. But ideas are not about, at least in humanities, they're not about being correct. They're actually about being stimulating. So there was a friend of mine who used to say, it's more important to be stimulating than to be correct.
Okay.
There are some great scholars who are about correctness because they try to get their facts right about very fundamental things, but such scholars are very few. Most scholars who do factual histories are not great scholars. And sometimes great scholars, like Gibbon, are not necessarily correct. People have come back and reinterpreted their things. Like Jadunath Sarkar is a great scholar. But you respect their truth for factual correctness, their quest for factual correctness. That is one kind of intellectual path. The other thing is, but if you like ideas, then you soon realize that ideas give you perspectives, and perspectives are no guarantee that you are correct. I mean, you try to have a perspective that explains as wide a collection of facts as possible. But somebody else might have another perspective. So, to give you a simple example, I learned recently a scientist in America sent me something, and he said, look, Freud looked at dreams and made dreams all about family relationships, father, child, mother, repression, sexuality, blah, blah, blah. If Freud had taken more interest in evolutionary biology, he would have known that all mammals dream. Dreaming is part of mammalian life. Dogs dream, cats dream. Dreaming is part of normal sleep cycles. Then he would have known that you can't squeeze it all into human family dynamics.
Right.
Right? That you can't squeeze it all into bourgeois family. Because if it is evolutionary, then we've been dreaming for far longer than the bourgeois family has been in existence. So you realize that if you take an evolutionary biology perspective, this thing looks different.
Yeah.
If you take a deeply Freudian perspective, it looks different. But at the same time, there's no denying that Freud is an extremely stimulating person to read. So nobody in psychology departments takes Freud as correct, and they don't teach him. Freud is mostly taught in English departments. Right? Because he's given us a way of reading texts. So the interpretation of dreams is actually more useful to Althusser than to a practicing psychologist. Right? And what I realize is that what is interesting in this erudite, intelligent, real pundits, but also really good thinkers, is that they take some fundamental question and make you think about it. So Marx took a very fundamental question for his time. Factories were coming up. So his very fundamental question was, what makes one thing exchangeable with another thing? So his thoughts about money, commodity, exchange, generalized equivalence. I mean, today, I can say with some conviction, there's nothing like abstract labor that Marx assumes. It doesn't exist. I could say with some conviction. But having made that assumption, which on hindsight looks like an erroneous assumption, Marx built a wonderful architecture of thinking that even today is one of the most productive ways of looking at the history of capitalism critically. In other words, if somebody asked you, how will you think critically about capitalism? Then I would say, for all his mistakes, Marx is still somebody who gives you one framework. You might question it. So I came to realize that there is no end to questioning. And the moment you think that I have arrived at some explanation and I can now go on applying, you have basically made your intellect dull.
Okay.
So I often say to people, look, the most moral statement is not necessarily the most challenging statement.
Okay.
You know, if somebody said to me, every person should have enough to eat, I said, I can't disagree with that. But it doesn't excite me as a thought. You know, it's a good thought. I mean, I don't deny its moral value. But it's not challenging me in any way because I thought this anyway. So if I were already of the position that no, only the rich should eat and the poor should not eat, then the thought would have been new.
Reiterating the already told.
Right. So when the climate crisis happened, and everybody was saying that climate change is because of capitalism, but capitalism is something you already know. So then the whole point was to ask, who can I blame for this? And that may be morally interesting. Let's blame the rich of the world, let's blame the rich nations. And that may even be correct to a degree, because I think the rich have more responsibility, there's no question. But what it means is that you only apply, just as the economists did the same thing. The moment the climate crisis became known, the economists had developed a literature on risk analysis. Why? From 1921, there was an economist called Frank Knight who wrote a book called Risk and Uncertainty. And if you think about the history of capitalism in the 20th century, think of things like life insurance, think of actuarial studies, think of pension funds. They all exist by managing risk. So when you get a life insurance, the company assesses the risk to your life. Do you smoke? Do you have a heart disease? When you get your house insured, they basically look at the risks the house has. So 20th century capitalism has been about managing risks. So and the distinction they make is that risk is the uncertainty you can measure. So there are mathematical ways of actually converting uncertainty into risk, because once it is measurable, then you can put a price on it. So once you say, okay, there's only 10% chance of this house suffering from, say, in Calcutta, and the insurance company says, okay, this house, it doesn't have much chance of suffering an earthquake, but a house in Kathmandu might, right? So basically, capitalism, our modern societies are managed by knowledge of science and other kinds of knowledge, which eventually is converted into risk analysis. And when banks lend money, they have risk analysis. All these principles, will this project actually fructify? So the moment climate crisis happened, all the economists did was to say climate is a risk. And they employed the risk literature to formulate policies about climate.
Okay.
They did not do anything new.
That's why you keep on saying that you are distinct from the policy people.
Yeah, but I don't have the training to it. But also, there was only one economist, a man called Martin Weitzman at Harvard, who actually says that if the climate gets to a tipping point, in other words, the global warming is so bad that a lot of disasters happen, then the risk literature doesn't apply. Because, so basically in the risk literature, if the risk is very high, then you take maximum precaution. That's the policy. So if translated, it means if you really think the risk is very high, you should stop producing coal today. That's the maximum precaution. Nobody is prepared to do that. So you have to say the risk is lower than that. So that you can say, okay, maybe you can go all producing coal till 2040. Right? Because people have already invested in coal. They want to have some return on that money. And they will also make calculations, say, okay, what is the risk? But economists are simply carrying on with the tools of trade they had developed. Similarly, when Marxists say it's because of capitalism, they're carrying on with the tools of trade they'd already developed. So I personally found, even if they're right, there was nothing new to think about in it. Whereas when I was reading these Earth system scientists, who are also historians of the planet, I realized that there was a lot more to learn about what makes human life possible. As I was talking about the atmosphere, what happened. So this whole connection between the seas, life, plants, gas, that this thing works as a system and we are part of it. When I began to understand that from that perspective, there was a lot more to learn. And you also begin to realize that capitalism is a very important, large, but only a part of the problem. That if the capitalists have agency, the planet also plays a role. For instance, you might put out a lot of greenhouse gas. It warms up, but for some reason the planet produces a lot of clouds. Then clouds might have a cooling effect. Or something else might actually, in other words, to understand these processes, I realized that I have to stretch my Marxist categories. Just as Franz Fanon said that when you take Marxism to the colonies, You have to stretch its categories. Because Marxism cannot explain race. This was his position. Similarly, I felt that when it comes to this crisis, Marxism, which only thinks of the globe that has a 500-year-old history,
History of capital,
is actually incapable of producing this perspective that geologists and biologists are together producing, which is of a much longer time scale, right? And so I said, look, this is about capitalism, but it's also about a certain species along with other species and technology dominating this world. And you might even look at capitalism itself as a strategy that the human species adopted in order to dominate the world. Right? So it could be, so I made this statement somewhere that if you want to know what human beings do to one another, then you have to zoom in and look up close at human beings.
Zooming out.
And I said, if you want to know what human beings are doing to the planet, you have to zoom out, right? And see what's going on. So that was, so when I claim in Climate book, that's what the criticism I got from Marx is, so why aren't you saying it's only capitalism? And I said, it's not only capitalism.
Yeah.
And capitalism would not explain, for instance, why our population grew so much. Modernization would, but not just capitalism.
Yeah.
Because India was not so capitalist.
Yeah.
But India was modernizing. Modernization. So yes, anyway.
Yeah. Thank you for this. Yeah, now then we come to this major issue you engaged with, this provincializing Europe, PE. PE actually had a mesmerizing effect on many people across the globe. And as I said, a provocative comment on this goes like this. Read this book. It will change your vision about past, present and future, whether you are in Mexico or in Egypt or in US or maybe in Calcutta, whether you have a discipline or you don't. And somebody, Charles Taylor perhaps, he has said this, that you have you are gifted, you are privileged to have that extraordinary bilingual consciousness, which can bring into illuminating relation between, at one end, Adam Smith or Einstein, and at the other, Tagore. And somebody said that, Amit Chaudhary said that you are both as a critic and archivist of modernity. Would it be appropriate to suggest, keeping this in mind, would it be appropriate to suggest that some of your foundational ideas on post-human and post-colonial perspectives on modernity more clearly visible in this book than your engagement with the earlier subaltern project? You have already
in provincializing Europe, in
provincializing. You have already been highlighting on these aspects, so I don't need again to reiterate those things, but only just very calculated way. Whom would you privilege? Whether PE is more visible
PE is more foundational. Yeah, because PE, in some ways, PE explains, as I said, it elaborates on that last chapter of rethinking. So PE is, I think, PE became more foundational. Provincializing Europe was a book I had to write. As people say, there are some books you want to write, and some books you have to write.
Okay, under pressure, as you said. Somewhere you have said very interestingly, ripening of the fruit and something waiting to happen.
I was hiding.
So is that something to do with that? Yeah. It was about to happen?
Yeah, it was. It's very, provincializing Europe, I would not have been able to write if I had had a career in India. It is an exilic, it comes out of an exilic migrant life.
Okay.
Because two things. That I worked within European traditions. It became very clear to me only by more I moved into universities in the West that were themselves aware of the Western tradition.
Of the
Western tradition.
Okay.
See, in Calcutta, Marx was like an Indian person who we thought in English. We didn't even care that he wrote in German. So he was like an ancestor figure. He was just right. If I had said in Calcutta to my friends, look, Marx might be wrong, they would stop talking to me. Because here, it was a culture where opinions form factions. Bangla we say doladoli. Do you have that in Odia?
Yeah, yeah.
Dol? So, moth and dol go together here, right? When I went to Australia, Australia was not, Australia did not have universities of, I say this with respect, of the caliber of a place like Chicago or others, where the humanities courses are very, very aware of what humanities have to do. So for instance, when I first went, I taught the Communist Manifesto in first year courses under social science and under humanities.
Okay.
In social science, when you teach the manifesto, you ask, so what is Marx and Engels' argument about social change? In humanities, you ask, what is the genre called manifesto? When was the genre invented? What are the figures of speech that Marx employs? So I became even more aware of the distinction between social science and humanities. In Melbourne, it was all together in the Faculty of Arts. Right? Here, the institution itself had divided itself on this question, that humanities and social science are not the same. And then within the humanities, there's one person who is just a professor of Montaigne studies. The person who is a specialist on Heidegger. So I actually say that when you come to South Asia department, Muzaffar Alam has to cover 300 years or more, 500 years of Muslim rule. If you come to Western language departments, a Western intellectual is assigned to one person. Somebody is a specialist on Goethe. So their area studies is much deeper than our area studies. And they are much more aware that there is something called Western tradition, which they want to distinguish from other traditions. And they're interested in knowing what the other traditions are. So a Western Sanskritist is actually interested in knowing how the Indian rasa analysis tradition is different from Western aesthetics. So actually I became much more aware that I'm speaking as an intellectual trained in Western traditions. Whereas Calcutta, I would have been simply aware of myself, I'm a political person. And what the position I stand for speaks the truth about India. BJP is telling lies, I'm telling the truth. There, I realized that the claim, even within teaching Western civilization or teaching Western, the claim is not that Hegel is true and Kant is wrong. The claim is that between their debates and division, they constitute something like Western civilization. And Marx is deeply a part of Western civilization. So first of all, going to the West and going to the more self-reflexive institutions of the West made me more aware of how much in the Western tradition I was writing myself and thinking. That made the question then of what was the role of the history I had before the West came also more important. So then I realized that, we used to discuss Vidyasagar as a Sahridaya person. But in Bengali, in my school, Bengali, high school Bengali, I only knew that Sahridaya was somebody who could be compassionate and sympathetic. But it's only when I then talked to Sheldon Pollock, who was teaching the Rasa Shastras, I realized that Sahridaya was a theoretical category in the Rasa literature, because the Rasika is a person who has to be Sahridaya in order to get the Rasa. And then I realized that this word, that had become an ordinary lazy word in my upbringing, actually had a theoretical locus in a tradition to which, even though it was part of my history, I'm not deeply connected. I'm much more deeply connected to Marxian traditions by my upbringing. Then I'm connected to that tradition, because in Nehru school, I did not have to study Sanskrit beyond class 8. Languages were less important than learning physics. So I realized that, when you see a Western scholar of humanities, they control 7-8 languages. Sometimes 7-8 medieval languages, if they're medieval scholars, because they have to read manuscripts in all these languages. Sheldon Pollock was trying to do that. And Shelley was always saying, India has lost this tradition because of this India's overemphasis on STEM subjects, the problem that I was talking about in the food years. But all this awareness that PE has, so it sort of sent me back. So I say in Provincializing Europe that I'm writing about Bengali society methodologically, not because I'm a Bengali. But the accident of being a Bengali meant that if you, and having grown up as somebody who loved the language, if you gave me a page of Bengali, I will be able to tell you that this expression is pre-colonial. This expression comes from Muslim contact. This expression comes from Portuguese contact. I see the archaeology of a page. I can't do that with English very well, because English was my second language growing up. Bangla was my first language. Then I realized that methodologically, if I work with Bangla sources, then I will at least be able to point to the words that once had a theoretical position and that have fallen into theoretical disuse, which have become lazy, ordinary words like Sadida. That was the project in Provincializing Europe, right? To then realize that yes, these European thoughts are indispensable because we want to have equality, we want to have rights, we want to have these things. But they're at the same time both indispensable and inadequate. Because there's all this other part of my history which are there as practical things and are almost inaccessible as theoretical things. Because I didn't want to be an indigenist. I didn't want to say, I don't want to my Marxism, I don't want my Hegel, Kant. I was already too much in love with those people. Yeah. And benefited too much from those people. That's why I say that European thought is a gift which I accept in an anti-colonial spirit of gratitude, right? So, or often I say to Western friends, I said, the message of European thought was good, the messenger was very bad. We didn't like the messenger and we didn't need the messenger. But the thing is, at the end of the day, I think a good thought is a good thought. An interesting thought, it doesn't matter who puts it out. If you have access to Sanskrit, if you have access to Persian, you might find a very interesting thinker who can think beyond his own age, right? If you have access to ancient Greek, you probably read Aristotle differently and you find. But what had happened in our history is that the Rasa texts are very interesting because Rasa text, this discussion is almost continuous from say 8th century to the 18th. And then colonial education clips it. And post-colonial education does it even more, right? So in that sense, I was saying that if I had continued, if my career had continued in India,
it could not have been possible.
The mold for thinking...
In a particular mold.
Yeah, the mold is given.
Okay.
And then you think. Whereas my work has been about breaking the mold. Partly because out of this realization that when you take the mold for granted, you stop thinking.
Okay. That could be the major point. It's again coming back to this particular point you made. I mean, within that broader dynamics of indispensability and inadequacy, PE issues a call for thinking about number of concepts and ideas, categories, and PE is in fact peopled with these things. For example, history too, different ways of wording the art, problematization of time, subaltern past, Samaya Granthi, time knots, doubling of consciousness, based on a rich conversation between Marx and Heidegger. How do you look at the cluster of these ideas, given your current engagement with sort of planetary history and concerning the history of capital?
Right.
Because history too, I think, is a very interesting idea to be taken forward,
Right.
Which has not, unfortunately, not had picked up.
Right. So, well, I mean, it has actually been picked up, in overseas.
Okay.
A lot of people in music history, in religious history. There's a scholar at Harvard called Amy Hollywood, who used this idea of history to. It has been picked up quite majorly, not in India.
No, that's
again because I think
with the resistance.
Yeah, I mean, because it's a different kind. The interest in Marxism is so Marxist.
Okay.
Whereas the interest in Marxism in America or Europe is often academic and not politically Marxist.
Okay.
So they're not trying to save Marx from criticism. Whereas here, sometimes people are trying to be Chibbar's criticism for it, even though he's based in, he's trying to protect something. So if you go back to provincializing Europe, I was very interested in how to think about difference and what is shared. And History 1, History 2 was trying to address that. Even though, so there is what I was saying was that even though there is a so-called logic of capital which proposes a universal history of capital, I was qualifying that history by proposing history tools everywhere, right? So am I left with relativism then? Because I was not a relativist. For me, the real universal in provincializing Europe was provided by Heidegger and phenomenology. Because Heidegger would say all human beings have to be past-oriented, individual, because you're always moving towards death. So you're moving towards death. So you're moving towards the end of your life. And at a certain point in your life cycle, you become aware of it. So once you're into your 40s and your body begins to produce problems, people say, okay, so jokingly people say, okay, now you're no longer young. And because you're always aware as human beings, you would say that your life will end, the finitude problem, that your life is finite. Therefore, it makes it aware of the past because your life is constantly moving back into the past.
Sure.
So when it comes to my age, there's more of your life that is in the past than in the future. And he's saying human beings move towards that. And that's why there's a peculiar past consciousness we all carry. So for him, the capacity to have a consciousness about the past is a more fundamental capacity than the capacity to write history. Capacity to write history is one way of addressing that need. Memory could be another way. Dancing could be another way, right? So phenomenology, which is the subject that looks at human capacity to experience at an abstract level, because you don't define that human. That human could be anywhere. Provided me with some universal basis. Doing climate change, I realized that actually this human is historicizable, provided you take a much longer term history. So to give you an example, Heidegger says that the capacity to get bored is a universal human capacity. So boredom, he says, one of the basic moods of Dasein. He says, if you read history of the brain, human brain, then you realize, people can now, because the brain develops in modules, right? So, like, it's not it doesn't develop incrementally. A particular model develops suddenly. So when people have looked at the history of human skulls, they can reconstruct the development of the brain, and they can now say with reasonable, certainty, when it was in human history that the part of the brain where you experience boredom was created.
I see.
So actually, all the capacities that phenomenologists assume are evolved capacities. And as I was saying, evolved capacities are always with us. See, so there are culturally constructed capacities, and so to give you an example, that we are having a conversation for an hour or so with some focus and attention, this is a culturally evolved capacity. Why? Because this always assumes that there is no danger to us. 5 squirrels will not be able to do this. They will always be looking this way and that way to see if there's a predator around. If this was a space where there's always a risk of dacoits coming through, you would not be able to focus like this. So the capacity to collectively focus on something is a culturally evolved capacity. The capacity to be distracted, which has to do with survival, is a biologically evolved capacity. So it is much easier to get distracted, which is why cell phones work and these things work, because now capitalist consumption is about getting distracted, right? This, that, 24/7 news, it's all about getting distracted. That's why if you go to a classroom, they'll say, you have to remember the children can't focus. When I first taught in Berkeley, they said you have to crack a joke every 12 minutes because that's as frequently as advertisements come on television. So they can't focus for more than 12 minutes, then crack a joke. And that was a joke. But now actually
we live in those times.
We lived in those times, right? So only this generalized, capacity for ordinary people like you and me and him and others to focus is probably a capacity we've developed over the last 100 years as we've gone to school, college, university. So what I was saying is that I realized that that Heidegger or Husserl actually took an evolutionary history for granted. So, as I said, what you're doing now with your fingers, this is an evolved capacity. A chimp will not be able to do this. But that's how your fingers evolved. And everything you use has to do with how fingers have evolved. Whether you're running a fighter plane, piloting a fighter plane, or driving a car, it has to do with evolved capacities. So, evolution historicizes, gives us a bedrock of history for all human beings. So I realized that there is a slower history that's running through all of us. It is older than national histories. It is older than linguistic histories, right? And it is much more connected to all this ecological stuff. These days I often think that when India went for linguistic states, Bihar was created, Orissa was created, we all thought that was a good thing because the British divisions were arbitrary. But that kind of assumption that people are made by languages was clearly environmentally blind. So now two states that share a river fight over it. Right? On the other hand, in Bangla, there are other expressions. In Bangla, we say Podda Parer Lok. People belong to Little Podda. Right? So I became aware of this other kind of mapping you can do of human history. But I still have to go back to Sartre and say, commonness does not create a common platform of action. So scientists sometimes think that if you recognize each other as members of the same species, you will stop fighting. That is utopian thinking for scientists. Sartre said in the introduction to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, he said, and Hegel said that actually, that we make a slave of another human being only because we recognize him to be human. You don't make a slave of a cow. There's certain kind of insult, certain kind of torture, certain kind of indignation you give only to another human being because you know that that human being has an evolved capacity to be hurt by it. Sure. You would want to, that's why you won't insult your dog because you don't know if the dog will understand the insult. You will go and rape the women of some other group because you know that group, being human, will be hurt in the same way as you would be if someone came and raped your women. So that's why Israelis and Palestinian problem will never be solved by the species question. Right? So, but the species question establishes that there is another level of historicity of which we partake in common, which matters, even if we cannot unite to represent that history. So the fact that we're in same, when I said it's capitalism and species, I was not saying that we should act as a species to do this. We can't. Species don't act like that. But I was saying we can perspectively keep it in our head that we belong, even as we fight each other, that we belong to some larger shared histories. Because when you don't remember it, then you end up fighting over the water of the same river. See, if India and Pakistan, look at the Himalayas. The Himalayan glaciers, rivers coming out of the Himalayan glaciers feed water coming out of it. The glaciers feed rivers in 7 countries, from Pakistan to Vietnam. there's no agreement between these countries about what to do with the glaciers. So if you think of the glaciers as only yours, then you will have a problem, right? So human history had come at a point where certain ways we are seeing the limitations of language-based identity, nation-based identities, province-based identities. Which is not to say that you can give them away, but we're beginning to see the limitations. Yeah. That's why this other perspective is needed.
Okay, thanks for this. I mean, the next question is almost, getting anticipated. This is finally coming to this Anthropocene thing. Your reflections on globalization and global warming, woven around this idea of Anthropocene project, I think seeks to very clearly again take it further. This familiar critique of historiography and historical thought, about which you have already said, particularly in the age of climate change. I mean, these four theses are quite known by now, but I'll just spell it out, like collapse of age-old humanist distinction between natural history and human history, configuring the humans as a geological force and a new geological epoch, and also bringing into conversation the global histories of capital and species histories of humans. And based on this strategy, you're thinking through, seek to eliminate at least the limits of history, as you have right now said, historical understanding. But my point is here, which is more challenging. I mean, it made me also think differently. How do you look at the trajectory and genealogy of such interventionist ideas revolving around Anthropocene project? I pose this question against the backdrop of Ranjit Goa's work already on limits of history, and that you have always improvised on his thoughts, if I may be allowed to say so, with my own limitations, very serious limitations.
He's been a great teacher. I mean, when Ranjit Da was talking about limits of history, he was basically saying we should go back to literature and other ways of dealing with the past, because he feels, like we said in the beginning, that this disciplinary form of history, see, in our country, it never really took deep roots. I mean, Jadunath fought for it and lost, with his own biases. When you look around, say in Odia nationalism, Bihari, Bengali nationalism, Bengali Muslim nationalism, most people are looking for a history or a version of the past that will make them feel good about themselves. Give them something you'll tell a child. This is why it's good to be an Odia. Now, this is why it's good to be a Bengali. And again, I have no problems with it at some level. It's needed for every human being. It is difficult to do that with the discipline. So Jadunath was always puncturing the claims of Bengali chauvinists, who would magnify the role of somebody in fighting the Mughals. And Jadunath tried to go to a source and he ran away at the first fight. That kind of stuff he was doing. And sometimes it takes very ugly forms. Even a very respected person like Ramesh Majumdar, at the height of one of the Bengal Kheda movement in Assam, he actually, you will find this book, I forget what it's called, he dedicates the book to Bengalis and then refers in the dedication to Ahom frogs. That Bengalis were doing this when the Ahom frogs were croaking. He's a great scholar, but I think that is a great moment of stigma in his career. I mean, he probably felt angry, but that is what happens when you. I mean, I still remember going to see when I was to go to the History Congress. History Congress was organized on the expectation that people will work on their own regions. Bengalis would present on Bengal, Odias would present on. Then there was a professor, I think Jena, his name is Krishna Chandra Jena.
From Barampur University.
Yeah. And he gave a paper on the 1866 famine, and what the role Bengalis played in it.
Okay. Okay.
Causing famine. It clearly an anti-Bengali paper, and history was full of these things. And Ranjit was saying that that for good and bad, this history discipline doesn't work. It is drawn into these other pressures, right? Instead of producing objective histories, we end up producing histories that will eventually express our love for our own people, whatever. So he said, look, maybe for us, history, literature is a better way of doing history, in the history of the world history. Whereas what I'm trying to do in this work, I'm trying to argue that if the planet was until now a word that belongs to scientists, not as a lazy word, but as a word that was alive, it is important to make this word now a part of humanist thinking by learning from the scientists. So what I say in the formal paper, which I didn't present, I begin by saying that you can read people writing histories of the planet as fellow historians with different tools. But making critical use of because when they talk about planet, they mean Earth system. For him, it's a alive category. It's an ensemble of relationships. And I said, I don't have the skills, but if I read them, then it gives me a perspective on global histories, which without reading that literature, I don't have. What is the difference? The histories of global histories are all referring to humans and human institutions and their role in creating the world that we live in. Earth system histories refers back to the role that other forms of life play in creating the world that enables us to live. So I was giving the atmosphere as one example. Life in the sea, biodiversity of the seas are another example. The role played by microbes and viruses is another example. So it makes us realize that we are deeply connected to other forms of life, and actually other forms of life go through our bodies. Our bodies don't have the kind of sovereignty that we think they have. So Locke would say, Marx would say that the laborer is the possessor of his own body. Right? But in that sense, we don't possess our bodies. There are zillions of microbes for whom we are the host. And we have interesting relations. They help you digestion. Sometimes they don't help you, they simply live there. Sometimes they become hostile to the host. Right? And the problem today is that we now understand that we are connected in this kind of way. We don't know how to bring that into what I was calling a new philosophical anthropology, how to make it the basis for political action. Right? Though we realize that if we only focus on human welfare, on distribution of wealth between humans, without caring to think about how many humans are there and what impact they have, then we will have an impact on the world which will in the end imperil us. Because climate change is a consequence of human beings having had the best time in their history. Humans have not lived so well as they have in the last 200 years. In spite of capitalism, in spite of everything, there are more humans, they live for longer. So this Harvard historian Steve Pinker, who keeps writing that the world is improving. The world is improving, it's improving for humans, but at some cost. Some cost immediately to other forms of life, but in the long term to human life. And that's why simply focusing on intra-human justice is not enough.
Yeah, I'm again, I don't know how to react to this. This idea of philosophical anthropology, you have been coined this particular idea at the right moment, because some of the understandings which really get into the minds of people when they look at you and read Anthropocene. They say whether he's a biologist or a geologist or a historian. So good that at least this should be made more visible as an idea. I think you should come up with something which very clearly says that no, I'm
No, I'm a humanist. I'm trying to read them. See, I go to all this literature to ask myself, does this enrich the humanities?
right. That's very interesting.
So if I can add another category to humanist thought, like the planet, if I can say the planet is now a philosophical category, if I can establish that, then I will have enriched the humanities.
Do you think that because of your grounding in physics and science, the early part and from the inception, I mean, has it fructified in terms of getting into a new domain, a new area?
It has helped in the sense that,
or you're going out of India in many ways. I mean, these are the two things.
No.
Okay. So, because you said it would have been again hammered with a Marxist rod, something like that.
No, true. As I said again, it's what I said about provincialism. It was easier to do this thinking from outside India.
Okay.
Why? See, look at India. India will be affected by climate change more badly than many other countries because of the coastline and the glaciers. Those are the two areas where we are very vulnerable. If the sea levels rise, then you will have refugees not just going out, but also coming in. And if the glaciers melt, you will have problems with the rivers, right? So we are vulnerable. But if you ask who are the countries where the scientists are actually explaining climate change as a general problem to the lay reader, they all come from the West. So, what you realize is that Western intellectuals still have a tradition of thinking on behalf of the world. And we have not developed that confidence to do it. When I was doing provincializing Europe, the worst criticisms I got were from Indian friends who used to think that I've become too big for my boots. Initially, very close friends said, Europeans have done all this. Why are you wasting your time doing it? Focus on something Indian.
Okay.
If I had a French name, they wouldn't have done this. Okay. So there's a kind of it tells me that India thinks of itself, India is an emerging power, but Indian intellectuals still don't think on behalf of everybody.
Okay.
And that is both a good thing and a bad thing. Because thinking on behalf of everybody produced imperialism.
Okay.
That's what I in provincial Europe. I said, how can you think of these people you don't know?
There's a sense of irony in you which is coming up.
Exactly. But exactly. So it's a good thing that we don't. But at the same time, if you are making a claim to a world status, then you have to take some responsibility for that world, right? So empires had these two sides. They colonized, but they took responsibility. And then I realized that this is why, you probably know this, this fourth thesis article was first written in Bangla.
No idea.
Oh, it was published in a local Bengali magazine, Baromash. And then my friends read it and said, yeah, it's interesting, we don't think these things. And the non-academic friend of mine said, climate change is a Western problem.
Look, we got to know it from English print, not
so
from
then
Bengal.
What happened was I went back and I was on the board of critical inquiry and they were short of articles. So the editor said to me, do you have something you can give us? So I wrote it up again in English, expanded it, gave it to them, and it got translated into so many languages, it sort of gave me a new life.
Yeah.
Within Europe and in America, in South America, in Turkey and other places, it got translated into Turkish, into Arabic, into Chinese. And it became one of the two most read articles in the entire 50-year life of critical inquiry. But that's because in the West, there is still, this tradition of German thinkers thinking of human condition without knowing all humans. As I said, there's a hubris in it. But the hubris is what has produced global world philosophies. Right? And so I realized that this is the other thing, my crisis. I always say to people, you belong to the culture where you know pop culture. So if you take me of West Bengal and Bangladesh, I will be able to talk about songs, band songs, and new things happening in cinema or whatever. I can't do that with America. I am not connected to pop culture. The only place where I have a connection to the West is at the most abstract level of philosophy, where my connections can be deep. I can deepen them. I can learn a language. I can read Heidegger. So it's a funny way. I sometimes say to people, I'm a Western intellectual who was raised in Calcutta.
Okay.
As we all are. Raised in Odisha or Balasore or Cuttack or Bhubaneswar. Because that's the tradition we've grown up in. So in a funny way, I have this. So the West has played a very important role in. But it also means that I've just had a book out called Crisis of Civilization from Oxford, a collection of essays.
Yeah.
And there's an essay there called Communing with Mac. And I say that I've become a person who looks at India both from inside and outside.
Okay.
And what it means is that sometimes I'm unable to share with Indians things I see from outside. And sometimes I'm unable to share with Westerners things I see as an insider. I can give you so when Wendy Doniger writes about Hinduism, I can understand why she gets criticized, though I don't agree with the criticism, but I can understand it. She only feels it as undeserved criticism, right? Unfair criticism. But even if it's unfair, I can, just as I was saying, I know where they're coming from. I know what's hurting. But at the same time, an Indian friend said, "Don't you criticize Wendy Doniger?" I said, "No, I'll always fight for a right to say what she wants to say." And she's stimulating her own right. Yeah. So I now occupy this in-between position.
That's really interesting.
My life to change it.
You shouldn't rather. Yeah, coming towards the end of it now, almost like two questions, one general, and then again a very lighter note to Dipesh Chakrabarty, not to Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty. Who has influenced you the most? A Marx, a Ranjit Guha, a Heidegger, a E.P. Thompson, a Amartya Sen, or for that matter, someone else like Dipesh Chakrabarty? Also, to quickly add, that a post-colonialist like Homi Bhabha refers to you as his soul brother. I leave it like that now to answer.
Quickly, a lot of the names you went through influenced me. So I would say Borunde.
Okay, that is a major miss.
Ranajit Guha. Anthony Lowe, my PhD supervisor. An Australian historian called Greg Denning, who was a historian of the Pacific. A Jesuit, a kind of lapsed Jesuit priest, but very interesting person. Philosophically, I would now say the most important thinkers are Kant, Hegel, Marx, and Heidegger, philosophically. Doing the Anthropocene work, Heidegger probably has been a very big influence in terms of thinking, how do I bring this into humanities? E.P. Thompson, I loved his spirit as a historian.
You said somewhere that he's your hero or something like
as
that.
a historian, I'll tell you why. Because, okay, here is a problem that we have. And this is a problem of this country, and I don't know why we don't address it, but it's a very serious problem. Our professional historians, you or me or him, we are required to write history in a language which is our second language. So A, it's not connected to real publics. B, it doesn't allow us to be really creative. Because we don't control the language to some degree. E.P. Thompson was a poet in English. He wanted to be a poet, and then he realized that he would not be as big a poet because there are other poets. I have a similar relationship to Bangla. I still write poetry for friends, but I realize that there are people who are much bigger poets in Bangla. But my relationship to that language comes back into what I write in Bangla. I can't do this in English, even though my English is what in Bangla we say cholable. It's cholable. But because I can earn a living and, but I know that I'm not an E.P. Thompson.
But you're part of the English department in Chicago.
All of those things. But I know when I read E.P. Thompson, I know that the language is putty in his hands. He can change it as he wants.
Okay.
If I write in Bangla, it's more like that. I have that feeling that
Yeah.
And automatically poets and people come into it. Automatically Jivanananda Das or Akhtaruzzamani, people come into it. It doesn't happen with English because I'm not trained that way. I've done science but then I look at my fellow historians here, we all have the same problem. Gautam Bhadra was the only one who resolved to write in Bangla,
Okay.
in subaltern studies, and Shahid writes in Hindi.
Perhaps Sanyal also. Yes, sorry.
Hitesh da. Yeah, Hitesh wrote in Bangla. That's true. But so Thompson is my hero because his language carries his passion. I mean, he was one historian who could write passionately. At the same time, write beautifully. But that's because he loved the language. And I think historians write. I mean, historians are writers, they're crafters, and they have to be in control of the language. Unfortunately, as I say to people, I said Germans became capitalist without having to give up German. French became capitalist without having to give up French. The English became capitalist without having to give up English. Why the hell do we have to give up our vernacular languages in order to do well in life? The moment, I mean, these elite schools in Kolkata don't teach Bangla.
Yeah.
Discourage kids from speaking in Bangla in school.
The passion would be either to speak in English or
And Hindi.
It's also everywhere.
So all these languages, so our languages have become preserves of less well-to-do families. The interesting poets in Calcutta now come from the Mufassals. This is a mad situation. I mean, this elite is killing itself culturally. And all they want is they want to come and do a PhD in Chicago or Oxford or something and get their job. I mean, and I don't blame them. The cities have become difficult, more competitive, they're asking for lifestyle. But I kind of think here we're destroying ourselves culturally because, why did Bengal Renaissance happen? Because rich families like the Tagores invested in the language. Well-to-do people took the language seriously. If well-to-do classes don't take a language seriously, lower middle classes don't have the resources. Because these people not only developed Bangla, they were learning Sanskrit, they were learning music, because families could resource that. Now, if we all have to become Hindi speakers, which will be good for Hindi, if that, but even Hindi, I'll tell you a sad story. A good friend of mine said to me with joy from Delhi that his son had just in year 9 finished the last exam in Hindi and he would never have to do Hindi again in life.
This is tragic.
It is tragic. So E.P. Thompson for me is been a lucky person because he belongs to a language which was not at odds with capitalism, with success in life, Whereas somehow we have come to think that success in life has to do with English. And that I think is a great loss. Yeah. So he's my hero.
Yeah.
But he's a hero who makes me sad.
That's the comment of the day. Yeah, finally. I mean, your collage is so pervasive and so vast that whatever I intend to ask, you have already answered. So that's the problem with the people. But anyway, finally, coming to the last question. What do you think? What else social science and human science in the academia across the globe and in general and global south and India in particular? And how do we address it? How do we address if there is some, how do you look at these problems? What else social science and human science in the global academia as well as global south and India? And what could be the ways forward? How do we address this? You have already said in relation to language, but if any other issue, because this would be really valuable to take these ideas forward to our students, to our teachers in the colleges, that people can be made to think about it. And
See,
because you were positioning in that part of the world. No?
so what is happening in the humanities there, I can speak of the humanities, is that humanities is embracing a lot more of science, neurology, brain studies, now geology or biology, to actually think about what does it mean to live in the Anthropocene. So, there's a war veteran in America called Roy Scranton, who was actually in Iraq in the Chota Bush War, that is after 9/11. And he came back and he wrote a very thin, but short, but very interesting book called Dying in the Anthropocene. Learning to die in the Anthropocene. So the premise is, there's a whole branch of philosophy which says that what philosophy teaches you to do is to learn to die. Because most people just die without thinking about death, but philosophy teaches you to be philosophical. Just as Hinduism, through this idea of ashramas, Garhastashram, teaches you how to withdraw from life. You get to the Vanaprastha, how to withdraw from life. And he says that, look, the civilization we are in is unsustainable for everybody. So we have to learn to live through a history through which this civilization will die. This industrialized, global, consumer-based, consumption-based, ecologically destructive civilization will probably die. And his answer is, we have all to learn to die with it. I reverse it, because learning to die doesn't sound good to most people. I know what he means. So I said, we have to learn to live in this world, in which probably the models of development that we are still pursuing are unsustainable. And already people are realizing that technology is moving in such a way that jobs will not be created to that degree. The jobs that are created will be different kinds. I don't know what these people do, but already people who install solar panels find that they have no regular 9-to-5 appointment, unlike in a oil field or in a mine. And unionists say it's very hard to organize them, because they do solar paneling in the morning, do something else. Jobs are getting fragmented. Not as many jobs are created because of the use of artificial intelligence, self-driven, smartphones, smart cars, these are coming.
Yeah.
There's a talk about universal guaranteed income for everybody. There's a talk. But we don't know if you're not, because we equate dignity with working. We don't give respect to an unemployed person. So if somebody is on a universal minimum income but not working, should we still respect them? These are all crises that we are facing, including planetary crisis. So I think we all have to think from our own places how to move into this kind of a world with humanity and humaneness, so that we prepare our societies for these coming crises. Edward Wilson, who's a very well-known evolutionary biologist at Harvard, but a guru figure, he has just written a book where he argues that half of the planet should be left to non-humans. Now, we're not going to do that. But it's clear that in every country, the habitable portion of the country will shrink. Which means people will move. Some places will become even more crowded. But how do we do that in a civilized manner, without barbarism, in an understanding manner, with creating an ethic of sharing? These are the tasks. And I think all social institutions, including academic institutions, should contribute to that task. So that's what I call learning to live in the Anthropocene.
And unlearning the already given wisdom.
Exactly, given wisdom. Unlearning
you have been emphasizing on this.
There's a very interesting case in Maharashtra. You must have followed it. Recently, do you remember there was a tiger that was killed called Anvi? Do you remember that?
No.
So it's in Maharashtra. It's in actually Tiger Reserve Park. But what's happening? People are moving into that park. The tiger had begun to kill humans. It had killed 11 humans.
Achha. In Odisha also recently same thing happened.
Throughout, even Indian story, it's happening everywhere. So these locals killed the tiger. You know why they killed the tiger? Even though there's a ban, because the tiger was teaching its two cubs to eat humans.
Okay.
So the tiger was trying to live in an area where humans didn't exist. Humans had moved in.
So you were trying to.
So tiger was trying to live in that new city by teaching her cubs to that, look, these biped animals are easy to eat.
Okay.
You know, they don't fight like buffaloes or they don't have horns or anything, you can eat them. And humans were scared that they would have a breed of tigers that would lose the fear of humans. The humans would be strange. But these are the conflicts that's happening throughout India. Throughout India and throughout the world, wild animals are trying to become urban. Foxes in London, foxes in Berlin, coyotes in Chicago. But I now read a lot about human-animal conflict in India, with elephants, with rhinoceros. And when you read this, see, these are the real problems we face, and how. That's why you should have more students working on human-animal relationships. I now have more students working on animals. So I've got a student who is doing his PhD working on human-animal relationship in the history of Calcutta.
The history of Calcutta.
Yeah.
Great. Fantastic.
Yeah. He's starting from 18th century. But look at because animals have been central, horse-driven carriages, horse-driven trams, they have once had.
Somewhere the Homi Baba said that you and also subscribe that there is a sad sentiment of concern. No, this also comes in. I mean, when you talk about this, I mean,
yeah. No, I mean, Homi has also been. We talk, and Homi has also been working on this rights question, refugee.
Yeah.
At the moment, the number of officially recognized refugees in the world, I don't know if you know the number, it's 65 million. So at the moment, there are 65 stateless people. Not counting internal refugees within countries, so people like Rohingyas, for instance. If the sea levels rise and the temperature goes up to 3 degrees, that number may be 300 million. So I think what we need to do is to give our students, our children, some rational appreciation of the world that is coming, so that the world does not get re-barbarized. You and I, we've all been very lucky. I often tell people that, so if you look at all the post-colonial countries after 47 that became independent, India is one of the few countries that has remained intact. Many other countries, Pakistan lost one wing to Bangladesh. We have more or less been intact except for the little bits that China has taken. And we've had a tremendous period of peace. I mean, small wars with these countries, but internally, on the whole, I mean, okay, the urban crimes, but on the whole, we've had a tremendous time of peace, reasonable stability in the banking system, so that people have could plan their lives, right? I'll retire, my children will do this. These kind of stabilities may go in the coming 50 years. So I think we should have courses in universities that actually discuss these things. Give people this perspective so that that's why I'm learning to live in the Anthropocene, so that we learn to live with these problems, solve the problems we can solve. There are problems we can't solve, they're too big, we have to negotiate them. Anticipating disaster is more important than facing disasters completely unaware. So disaster management is going to be very important. I know that the Odisha government, all these coastal governments are already aware of this problem. In fact, the Odisha government signed an MOU with some researchers at Chicago University on pollution problem.
Okay.
We've signed an MOU on pollution problem and actually also on digitizing Odia texts.
Yeah, this is what our development secretary Balakrishnan was there.
Exactly.
He was involved.
Yeah, he was involved.
I was also talking to him about you, and
right. Yeah,
and I'm interested in the kind of collections you have also.
Exactly. Yeah.
I met you there.
No, Jim Nye, who was our main librarian, went. He's retired now. There's a young woman.
In fact, I floated this idea to him.
Oh, did you? Okay, but that was a very good thing. But but what I'm saying is that at many levels. So we need courses in the universities, maybe team taught, maybe you need scientists and humans come together, teach introductory courses on these things, so that people become, we need people to rise above these narrow sectarian fights that we keep fighting. I mean, there are pressures for those things that they'll happen, reservation, this, that, because there's joblessness. This whole story of reservation for Marathas, for Patels, I mean, This jobless, educated youth, and that is going to also be a phenomenon we have to live with. And the task is, how do we remain civilized? It's both a global task and a national and provincial task. Kamal Nath's first statement on becoming chief minister is to blame UP and Biharis for coming to get the jobs, right? I mean, sort of, how do we teach our politicians not to?
Yeah.
Because we'll have more of these outsiders come.
We need to raise this voice.
Yeah,
the
and
academy has
we'll
to
have more
be
of these
very
outsiders come,
sensitive
because
about it.
if certain parts become uninhabitable, where will people go?
Yeah.
But unfortunately, our politicians with short-term point of view encash on these short-term difficulties, so that's what I feel.
Thank you very much, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, for at least making us, all of us, think through some of the pressing concerns of life, planet, time, and everything. And thank you for agreeing to join us in this conversation.
No, and I need to thank you for having read me with so much seriousness and attention, because
Still try to understand you. It's, I mean, as I said, it's an enigma.
To find a good reader is rare. But when you go back, I'd say try to
I look forward
develop
to
these courses, these kind of courses for your own students.
Yeah, I look forward to your visit to our university when we do the second round of interview.
Yeah.
And also, I'll request government of Orissa to, they will be happy to have you. I mean, talking to people.
No, that'll be.
And my special thanks from our Vice Chancellor, Professor
Thank you.
Ishan Patra, who is a neuroscientist.
Oh,
He's a
okay.
biologist. So you're trying to wrestle with biology and
Right.
geology
Very
with history
interesting.
would make all of us happy.
Interesting.
So thank you for this.
Yeah.